So yeah, that. Does the Book of Mormon make specific genetic predictions that are scientifically verifiable? Okay? This is the crux of the question. And if so, how can these predictions be formed into testable hypotheses? Moreover, how would you design a research program to test these hypotheses? And this is what it really comes down to. Now, again, the point is, there is nobody out there who has specifically designed a research program to get at the authenticity of the Book of Mormon using DNA. It has not happened. It might not ever happen, but certainly it has not happened. This is my argument. The Book of Mormon is in a class of problems that is very difficult to test with DNA evidence. Now, this is because of the nature of the problem. This is not the argument that somehow, because this is a religious history, you can't get at it. You're not allowed to get at it. This is the argument that if you take your word processor and you do a search and replace for the word Lamanite and you put fruit fly in it, you still would not be able to get at this question without great difficulty. And this is because DNA analysis can neither easily refute nor corroborate the lineage history as put forth in the Book of Mormon. Now, there are large classes of questions to which we as scientists would like to have access. There are a lot of interesting things we'd like to get at. Some are easier to get at than others. This question, from a scientific standpoint, is hard to get at, and I will point out why. And I would argue that DNA analysis does nothing to speak to the authenticity of the text. Well, this brings up a critical point now, okay? Let's assume that I'm sitting on the National Science Foundation on a board which is reviewing your research grant. And you have written a research proposal in which you have attempted to test the Book of Mormon and the authenticity using DNA. What are some of the issues you've got to consider? Well, the first consideration is, what is my hypothesis? What scientific hypotheses emerge from the Book of Mormon? Now, I've read the Book of Mormon a number of times, and my response is, there are no explicit scientific hypotheses. It was not written as a scientific text. If Joseph Smith turned it into NSF, he would have received no funding. Okay? It is not a scientific document. It was never intended to be. Okay? So what it then becomes is the notion of, okay, if there are no explicit statements of how to test it scientifically, are there any implicit statements? Well, you know, again, to find the explicit statements, one would have to find a verse which reads something like this. And when you shall receive these things, I would exhort you that you would sequence multiple genetic markers from all extant human lineages and verily perform a phylogenetic analysis. And it shall be revealed unto you that Lamanite lineages shall group with the Middle Eastern lineages, and these analyses shall be supported by all forms of data analysis and statistical tests, and he will manifest the truth of it unto you by the power of genetic analysis. And by the power of phylogeny you shall know the truth of all things. Okay? Well, this last part is actually something I teach to my students, but you know, this is an aside. Notice how I removed all the pesky language of praying and spirit and you know all that sort of stuff. And this is, of course, Moroni 10:3-4, RGE, Revised Genetic Edition. Okay, well, let's get a little more serious here. What are the implicit hypotheses, then, which may come out of the Book of Mormon? Well, I've broke them into two categories, and these are not meant to represent all the possible hypotheses one might pull out, but they're basically two extremes of a continuum where you have to consider when you're testing the Book of Mormon. The first is what I call the global colonization hypothesis. And this is the notion that when the three colonizing groups documented in the Book of Mormon arrived to the New World, there were three of them, and when they arrived, the New World was entirely uninhabited by other humans. Okay? So when they came, they were very lonely. There was nobody else around on the entire North and South American continent. Populations then expanded to fill North and South America, and there was a distinctive genetic signature characterizing the Middle Eastern source population, and that this existed within that population. Furthermore, it supposes that the colonizers accurately carried that pure genetic signature with them. Okay, so you've got a source population in the Middle East, you've got colonizers carrying a genetic signal with them. Colonizers formed a pure and isolated genetic island. Again, that means that when they arrived, there was nobody else around to input DNA. Hence, there was minimal introgression, or what we call gene flow, from any other source population, and that the living descendants of the Lamanite lineage can be identified prior to genetic analysis. Moreover, that the living descendants of the Middle Eastern source populations can be identified prior to analysis. We'll talk more about this in a bit of detail. And finally, that those pesky, complicated molecular events have played a minor or negligible role. Okay, this is one hypothesis you can test, and this is the best case scenario. This is the notion that you've got a few colonizers, they came to America, huge population explosion, no other problems going on with genetics and other input of information from other sources. Can we test this? Well, the hypothesis makes a prediction, and one could argue this prediction, that the descendants of the Lamanites, whoever they might be, and the Middle Eastern source population should carry the same genetic signature. The observation is that modern Native Americans carry a genetic signature suggesting Asian origin rather than Middle Eastern origin. Now, this is a point I'm willing to accept. The modern research on Native Americans thus far seems to suggest an Asian origin. So the conclusion then is that this global colonization hypothesis is incorrect. And I'm willing to accept the notion that this view, this interpretation of Book of Mormon history, does not fit well with current genetic information. I have no problem accepting that at all. But does rejecting the global colonization hypothesis mean that one must logically reject the Book of Mormon? Is this hypothesis the only hypothesis emerging from the Book of Mormon? Moreover, is this the most stringent test of Book of Mormon authenticity? Well, I would contend no, because there's another hypothesis out there, and let me explain this to you. And this is sort of at the other extreme, and this is the local colonization hypothesis. And this again states that there were 3 colonizing groups arriving to the New World, that the New World may have been inhabited by human populations of unknown origin. When these people arrived, there could have been welcoming parties. Okay? Population geographic range was much more limited in scope. We're not talking about all of North and South America. We're talking about a more limited geography. A distinctive genetic signature characterizing Middle Eastern origin may not have existed in the source population. Moreover, colonizers may not have accurately carried that pure genetic signature with them. Colonizers may not have formed a pure and isolated genetic island. There was potential extensive introgression, gene mixing, coming in from the native population, potentially corrupting or swamping out the colonizer signature. It is unclear who the extant descendants, the living descendants of the Lamanite lineages might be. It is unclear who are the living descendants of the Middle Eastern source population, and complicated molecular histories and events may have played a major role. Now, I read the Book of Mormon, and it seems to me that this hypothesis is at least as well supported, if not better supported, than the global colonization hypothesis. And a lot of these features, scholars on the Book of Mormon have been saying for 20 years now. Okay, so there's not a lot of new stuff here. Well, here is the problem. Given that hypothesis, what observations would refute it? What would you need to see to demonstrate that that hypothesis is wrong? What sort of data would you collect? What sort of experiment would you design which demonstrates that that hypothesis is wrong? Well, this is the crux of the matter. One could argue that any observed genetic pattern could fit this scenario. And if this is the case, this hypothesis is non-discriminating, and it really is non-testable. Okay, well, let's talk about the complications. I laid this out in front of you now as sort of the hypothesis that we're interested in looking at. Now, again, back to this notion. You are writing a grant. I am reading the grant. If you want to get funded, you've got to satisfy me on some points. And I'm going to lay out 12 points that I need to be satisfied on. Now, this may hurt the heads of